All right, so as many of you already know, one of the first things that President Donald Trump did when he got into office was reinstate the global gag rule, which halts all federal funding to any institutions that provide abortions. So essentially, taxpayer money does not go to pay for abortions. But these same facilities also provide things like health screenings and birth control, and without that money, they can often close down and those services are no longer available. Now, we're not going to talk specifically about that gag rule, but we are going to talk about abortion. Now, I know some of you aren't even going to listen to this because I'm a dude and I'm talking about abortion, which isn't my place, right? Well, I don't really give a shit. Let's do it. Now, I do want to kick this off by clarifying that most of what I'm going to talk about pertains to voluntary mid to late term abortions. Cases where there was rape or incest or the mother's life is in danger should not be talked about in the same breath as all the rest. Those are particular special cases where the mother is often facing trauma or fear of death and should be put in a completely different camp. Now, generally when you talk about abortion, you break it down into two categories. Pro-life. What do you think, you can just go around killing babies in my country? Not on my watch. I am pro-life. I am for life. What are you, against life? What are you, some kind of monster? Fuck you! And pro-choice. Oh my god, like, it's my body, my choice, okay? You just keep your hands off of my body. It's my right to choose. What are you, against choice, you fucking monster? Fuck you! Sorry, I didn't have a blue wig. Now, both of those arguments look pretty good on their face. Who would be against life? Who would be against the right to choose? But when you really break it down and start to scrutinize these arguments, they begin to fall apart. So let's go ahead and take a stab at pro-life. One of the biggest things to consider is that no one's getting an abortion just for the fuck of it. If they reach that conclusion, then it's likely for a very good reason, and they probably faced a lot of mental strain to get to that point. And afterwards, they'll very likely face societal stigmas or persecution from friends and family. So pro-lifers acting like people are just willy-nilly getting abortions, I think that these people deserve a little more respect than you're giving them. It also seems like pro-lifers tend to value simple existence over any sort of quality of life or mental or physical health of the mother. They just want that baby to be born into this body and to exist here despite any of the other variables that may come into play. They'll even go so far as to put time and money and energy into creating laws to block people from getting abortions and forcing them to have these children, and then once it's had, it's up to a possibly unfit mother to provide for this baby. And that's not a good situation for anybody. Many pro-lifers also don't take the development of the child into account. From the moment of conception to the moment of birth and everything in between, they consider that to be a person, a human. And it's just totally dishonest to paint that with the same brush and compare a clump of cells to an 8-month-old fetus. Also, like what we talked about earlier, many of these places provide birth control and health screenings and simply a place where you can come talk to someone and gain some clarity and get some information that you may not have. And for these places to shut down and all those services to be removed, it's not going to improve the situation at all. Now that we've poked some holes in pro-life, let's move on to the equally weak argument of pro-choice. Now, the biggest argument that pro-choice has is that it's a woman's right to choose whatever she wants to do with her body. And while that seems kind of hard to dispute, you have to admit at some point along the line in this pregnancy, it stops being just her body. There is a second being in the equation. Now, my boy Sam Harris has a great quote right here.
The ethical ballast is all on the side of the freedom for a woman to choose what to do with her body. But at a certain point, it is obvious it's not merely her body. You're talking about now a creature increasingly like a newborn infant who can feel pain and who has interests of some sort.
I don't think that anyone can honestly look at this and truly believe that it is her body and only her body until that fetus moves a foot down and out of the womb. Suddenly then it's a person. But anytime before that, it's not, and it's the woman's right to do whatever she wants with it. I don't think that's fair at all. Now, this leads me into what I think is one of the biggest issues with this argument, and it is the out of sight, out of mind aspect of it all. If you don't see something, it's much easier to rationalize your ideas of it and what you intend to do with it. It's even considered cruel to have the mother receive an ultrasound before choosing to have an abortion, even though that could provide the most information for her to make the most informed decision. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to obscure it as much as you can and do your best not to think about it as a person. And at some point, you are just lying to yourself. You're also not supposed to show or look at pictures of aborted fetuses. But if looking at them is somehow repulsive, then doesn't that indicate that maybe something's wrong here? We just need to be as honest with ourselves as we can possibly be when you're deciding on something so large. And to obscure reality in the way that I believe the pro-choice people do sometimes to justify the decisions, it's not honest. You also really need to look at these procedures that are being done to terminate these pregnancies. Sucking the brain out, tearing the fetus limb from limb. If these things were done to a 2-second-old infant, it would be considered murder without question, and we will get into that here shortly. And then there's really just the moral question of it all. When is it okay and when is it not okay? We've created laws and we've drawn lines in an attempt to make sense of it, but I don't think we have. One day it's considered okay, and the next it isn't. Why? Sam Harris has another great quote right here.
The convention of breaking a pregnancy into 3 trimesters and considering the first 12 weeks to be more or less a time at which one is free without any ethical concern to choose to terminate a pregnancy, I don't know that there is a neurologically principled stand to take there. I mean, any line you draw is going to seem arbitrary if you're a day on either side of that line.
My friend posted something on her Facebook the other day in defense of her pro-choice stance, and it said something to the effect of, it's easier for us to choose to pull the plug on a loved one who is on their deathbed than it is for us to terminate a pregnancy. And while I don't believe that's a fair comparison at all, because there's quite a bit of obvious difference between pumping artificial life into what is essentially a corpse and ending something that's just growing and just starting, it did make me think a little bit. Many of the pro-choice people don't consider a fetus to be a person while it's in the womb because it doesn't have desires or motivations of any kind, and it can't fully function on its own. But does that mean that the person in the bed is actually less human as well? If you think about it, the person in the bed is on mechanical life support, and the fetus is on a biological life support. So they are in similar situations. But is one less human or more human than the other? I guess it kind of comes down to what you define as a human. How many of your senses and faculties can you remove until you are considered less than human? And what if your brain functionality drops below that of, say, an ape? Is that ape now more human than you are? Just because you can't fully function on your own? The way in which we end the life of the person in that bed is also quite a bit different than the way we terminate that fetus. If we were to go ripping the arms and legs off of that old guy, or sucking his brain out, things might get a little strange. Now, there's something in particular I want to talk about, not only because it's interesting to me, but also because I think it does a great job of blowing the doors off the pro-life, pro-choice argument and just laying it totally bare and forcing us to rethink what we're doing, and that is the case of Kermit Gosnell. Kermit Gosnell was an abortion doctor in Pennsylvania for many years, and in 2011 his clinic was raided, and he was tried and convicted of 3 counts of murder, 1 count of involuntary manslaughter, and many counts of illegal late-term abortions. Now, I'm not going to go too far into this guy because there's plenty of information online. You can go read about him if you want. But when his clinic was raided, they found blood-stained sheets and urine on the floor, rusty equipment, as well as bottles and jars around the facility that had the remains of the fetuses inside them. There was also a very common practice called snipping, where he would remove the fetus from the womb, insert scissors into its back, and snip its spinal cord. It was commonly done, and the other workers said that they saw it happen hundreds of times. What I want to focus on in particular with this case are the 3 counts of murder that he was tried and convicted of and is now serving life in prison for. These weren't the murders of adults. These were fetuses that were born during an abortion procedure. He continued with the abortion, and thus it was considered murder. It doesn't get much more arbitrary than that. Now, if that procedure would have been completed while that fetus was still in the womb, it would have been considered a typical pregnancy termination. But because it moved a few inches down and out of the womb, suddenly it becomes a person, and now it is a murder. If there's anyone out there that can justify that logic, please come see me. And if those fetuses aren't actually people, then what's the harm of keeping the parts in jars? Why not? It sounds a little weird, because it is, but is it that we have more respect for those remains than we do for the fetus while it's in the womb? Something's not right here. The real question here is, when does life begin? When does consciousness arise? As of right now, we don't know, and we should not pretend like we do. Like, what if you were making a salad? When does it stop being individual ingredients and become a salad? Is it right when you put the lettuce in the bowl? I mean, that's the main ingredient. It's right there. Or is it when you start adding the carrots and the beets or whatever you put in a salad? When is it okay to just toss it? And when do you have to say, hey man, that's a full salad, someone's going to eat that? Perfect analogy. You can argue all day that it's a person at the moment of conception, or that it's a person the moment the brain starts to form, or that it's a person the moment that it starts to show independent movement, or that it's a person only when it comes out of the womb. But these are such narrow fields of vision, and we have to step back and broaden our perspective on this massive, massive issue. Pro-life and pro-choice are both ideological arguments. They are schools of thought that you can subscribe to and fight for, because it is so much easier to just compartmentalize down these very complex ideas into little digestible pill forms, and then there you go. There's how you think. Instead, we really need to be occupying this enormous gray area in the middle where discussion happens and compromise happens, instead of staying on the extreme ends and just shouting at each other. I think it's really indicative of a larger problem in this country, which is cutting every argument straight down the middle. You're either on this side or you're on this side. You're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're pro-life, you're pro-choice, you're pro-gun, you're anti-gun. It is the most divisive and unproductive way to handle an argument. Nothing gets done in that sort of environment, and it must change. Discussion and honesty has to be at the forefront of this, not ideology, not emotion, not personal experience or influence. It has to be pure intellectual honesty until we can get anywhere on this topic. All right, thanks for listening. I appreciate it, and I got to get out of here. My dog got knocked up, and it's just not the right time to have puppies, so I got some work to do.